In the quiet town of Willowbrook, a place where life moved at a gentle pace and the streets were often empty, something unimaginable happened one day. It was a day like any other, with the sun shining brightly, the birds singing, and the townspeople going about their usual business. Yet, for the 8 nuns of the local convent, the day would change everything. These 8 women, all from different walks of life, had come together in faith. They had devoted their lives to helping the community. Every morning, they woke up early, prayed together, and spent their days helping the sick, feeding the hungry, and caring for anyone who needed assistance. Their lives were simple, focused on service, and the town knew them well for their kindness. On the afternoon of their disappearance, each nun had their own small task to complete. Sister Margaret was known for her kindness to the elderly and had promised to visit Mrs. Johnson, an old woman who lived at the edge of town. Sister Anne, the youngest, was sent to the market to buy supplies for the convent. Sister Mary was going to help with a charity event at the local school. They all had their own errands, and the town, accustomed to seeing the nuns come and go, thought nothing of it. Hours passed, and by the evening, there was still no sign of the 8 women. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe they were running late, or perhaps they had decided to stop for tea or catch up on some personal matters. However, as nightfall approached and the convent was still silent, concern began to set in. The townspeople began to ask each other if anyone had seen the nuns, but no one had. A few of the convent's closest friends started to get nervous. Surely the nuns wouldn't simply disappear without a word. Sister Anne had left her purse at the market, and Sister Margaret had not arrived at Mrs. Johnson's house. It wasn't like them to abandon their responsibilities. By midnight, the sheriff was notified, and the search began. The first place they looked was the convent itself, but when they arrived, it was as if the nuns had never left. Their rooms were tidy, their personal items still in place, and there were no signs of a struggle or anything unusual. It was as though the women had just vanished into thin air. The sheriff and his deputies searched the town from one end to the other, knocking on doors and asking anyone if they had seen anything unusual. No one had. The roads leading out of town were quiet, and there were no cars parked at the edge of town. The next day, the sheriff contacted the local police and requested assistance from the state authorities. The town was small, and news of the missing nuns spread quickly. Reporters and journalists arrived eager to find out what had happened, but they were just as puzzled as the townspeople. The only clue was that there had been no sign of struggle, and no indication that anyone had been taken. It was as if the nuns had simply walked out of the town, never to return. The FBI was called in shortly after, but even they couldn't make sense of what had happened. The convent, once a beacon of peace and faith, became the site of one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of the region. The community, who had relied on the nuns for so much, now found themselves in a state of shock and confusion. What could have happened to them? Why would 8 women, all devoted to their faith, vanish in broad daylight with no explanation? As the days turned into weeks, rumors began to swirl. Some people suggested that the nuns had left on their own accord, possibly feeling overwhelmed by their duties or seeking a new life somewhere far away. But this seemed impossible. The nuns had always been committed to their vows, and they had never shown any signs of wanting to leave. Others wondered if something more sinister had happened. Had they been kidnapped? Had they been taken by a group of people with malicious intent? The idea seemed far-fetched, but there was no evidence to suggest otherwise. Some even whispered that the town's more powerful families might have had a hand in their disappearance, though no one had any proof. The FBI and local authorities interviewed everyone who had come in contact with the nuns, but no one could provide any meaningful information. Months passed, and the case grew cold. The town of Willowbrook, once filled with hope and faith, now became a place of grief and uncertainty. The convent closed its doors and people moved on with their lives, though many couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. No one had ever stopped looking, but the chances of finding the nuns seemed slimmer with each passing day. Years went by, and the story of the 8 nuns became a distant memory, one that was talked about only in hushed tones. Willowbrook moved, on, but for some, the mystery remained. What happened to the nuns? Were they alive somewhere, or had they met a darker fate? The case was never solved, but it remained in the back of everyone's mind. It wasn't until 3 decades later that a small clue was uncovered. A former FBI agent named John Carter, who had worked on the case when it was first reported, was now retired and going through old case files. He had never been able to shake the feeling that there was more to the story than anyone had realized. While sifting through old documents, he found something he hadn't seen before: a ledger buried deep within the files. It was something no one had noticed when the investigation first began, and it was something that would change everything. The ledger contained cryptic entries, each one referring to dates and names that seemed to have no connection. But when Carter looked closer, he saw that one of the dates coincided with the day the nuns disappeared. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence. But as he continued to examine the ledger, he realized that it held the key to unraveling the mystery that had haunted Willowbrook for years. This was no ordinary ledger. It was a record of something much bigger, something that no one had ever been meant to see. The discovery set Carter on a path that would lead him back to Willowbrook, and it would bring the truth to light, a truth that had been hidden for far too long. What had really happened to the 8 nuns? The answers were just within reach, and Carter was determined to uncover them, no matter where the investigation took him. But little did he know that the ledger was only the beginning of a much larger and far more dangerous story. John Carter sat at his desk, staring at the old ledger in front of him. The dim light from the desk lamp barely illuminated the pages, but that didn't matter. His mind was racing with thoughts about what he had just discovered. He had never expected to find anything of significance when he decided to revisit the cold case of the missing nuns. After all, 30 years had passed. The investigation had been closed for decades, and most people had moved on with their lives. Yet, here he was, holding something that could change everything. The ledger was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. It wasn't just a simple record of financial transactions or notes from the investigation. It was a detailed account of events that had happened during the same period the nuns had disappeared. Some of the dates in the ledger matched the exact day each of the nuns had gone missing. The more Carter read, the more he felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was a clue, a breadcrumb leading him back to the mystery of the missing women. The ledger was filled with cryptic notes and names that Carter didn't immediately recognize. At first glance, it seemed like a jumble of random entries, but something about the dates stood out. He couldn't help but feel that whoever had written this had tried to hide something, perhaps even intentionally burying it. Carter's heart raced. There was something bigger going on here. But what? And how did the nuns fit into this? He knew he needed to take a closer look. With a deep breath, he leaned forward and started reading more carefully. The ledger contained entries about various individuals, many of whom had high social status in Willowbrook. They were business owners, politicians, and well-known members of the community. But there was one name that stood out: Father Henry Matthews, the priest who had been in charge of the convent at the time the nuns disappeared. The more Carter read, the more it became clear that Father Matthews had been involved in something far darker than anyone had realized. The ledger hinted at shady dealings, secret meetings, and large sums of money being transferred to unknown accounts. These were not typical donations or church expenses. These were suspicious transactions. Carter couldn't believe what he was reading. It seemed as though the very people who had been responsible for guiding the nuns had been involved in something criminal. The entries mentioned covert operations, but there were no details. The vague references made Carter feel like he was holding a puzzle with missing pieces. He quickly realized that the nuns had likely stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to, something hidden behind the walls of their own church. Were the nuns part of a larger conspiracy? Had they been taken to silence them because they knew too much? The more questions Carter asked himself, the more he realized he needed to go back to Willowbrook. He needed to find out exactly what the ledger meant and what it had to do with the nuns. But this time, things would be different. This time, Carter wasn't going in as a simple investigator following a lead. He was going in with a mission to uncover the truth and bring it to light. As he sat in his small office, Carter made a decision. He would reach out to the people who had been involved in the original investigation. Perhaps they had missed something, too. Maybe they had overlooked a crucial detail that, with the benefit of time and experience, would now make sense. But most importantly, Carter had to go back to Willowbrook. He couldn't do this from behind a desk. He needed to be there in the town, speaking to the people who had lived through the nuns' disappearance. The next day, Carter packed his things and left his office. His mind was already racing ahead, planning the next steps of the investigation. He knew this would be a difficult journey, but he felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. The missing nuns, the conspiracy hidden in the ledger, and the unanswered questions all pointed towards something bigger than he had ever imagined. As he made his way to Willowbrook, Carter couldn't help but think about the nuns. They had been women of faith and service, and now, all these years later, their names had become part of an unsolved mystery. The town had never forgotten them, but neither had the authorities. The case was still marked as unsolved, and no one had truly understood why the nuns had disappeared. People had long since moved on, but Carter had never been able to forget the haunting images of their empty rooms, the unspoken fears of the townspeople, and the strange silence that surrounded their disappearance. Now, as Carter pulled into the familiar streets of Willowbrook, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This time he wasn't just a man revisiting old files. He was a man on a mission to uncover the truth. He headed straight for the old sheriff's office, where the investigation had started all those years ago. It had been closed for so long that the building seemed abandoned, but as he walked in, the dusty shelves and old furniture told a story of its own, a story of a case that had never truly been solved. Carter sat down with the sheriff's retired deputy, a man named Jack McAllister, who had been involved in the investigation years ago. Jack was now older, his face lined with age, but his memory was sharp. "I never thought we'd be sitting here talking about this again, Carter," Jack said, his voice tinged with regret. "The nuns. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to make sense of it, but there's no sense to be made. They just disappeared, gone, vanished into thin air." Carter nodded. "I found something, Jack, something that might change everything." He reached into his bag and pulled out the ledger. "I came across this while going through the old files. It's been hidden for years, and it's filled with information that might explain what happened to the nuns." Jack took the ledger in his hands and flipped through the pages. His eyes widened as he scanned the entries. "I've seen this handwriting before," he muttered, tracing the names and dates with his fingers. This is connected to the church, isn't it? Those names. I remember them from when we were investigating." Carter leaned forward, his voice steady. "I think the nuns discovered something they shouldn't have. I think their disappearance wasn't an accident. It was planned. Someone wanted them gone because they were about to expose something." Jack was silent for a moment, then slowly nodded. "You might be right. There were things that didn't add up back then. But we couldn't prove anything. We didn't have the evidence. Now, they had it." Carter could feel it in his gut. The ledger was the key to unlocking the mystery. But who would they have to confront to expose the truth? And what would the town of Willowbrook think once the secrets were out? As Carter and Jack continued to pore over the ledger, the answers began to take shape. But there was one thing Carter knew for sure. The road ahead would be dangerous. The people involved in the conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But Carter was prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The nuns deserved the truth, and he was determined to find it. Carter had never been more determined in his life. Sitting in the small, dimly lit room of the sheriff's office with Jack McAllister, he knew they were getting closer to something big. They spent hours reading through the ledger, piecing together the names, dates, and cryptic references. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the nuns had been involved in something much larger than anyone had ever imagined. It wasn't just a case of disappearance. It was a carefully planned operation, one that involved corruption and deceit stretching deep into the heart of Willowbrook. The more they learned, the more it became evident that the nuns had unknowingly uncovered something hidden within the church itself. It wasn't just about the simple lives they had led, helping the sick, feeding the poor, offering comfort to those in need. They had stumbled upon dark dealings, something far beyond their understanding, and paid the price for it. One of the names that appeared over and over in the ledger was Father Henry Matthews, the priest who had been in charge of the convent when the nuns went missing. At first, Carter had brushed it off as a coincidence, thinking that Matthews was simply part of the church's administrative details. But as he dug deeper, it became clear that Father Matthews was far more than just an ordinary priest. He was involved in secret meetings with powerful people, many of whom had strong ties to the local government and businesses. These were people who didn't just control Willowbrook, they shaped it. Father Matthews was at the center of everything, but there were no direct mentions of him doing anything illegal, at least nothing that was overtly obvious. His name appeared, alongside others who had large sums of money transferred to their accounts, but the transactions didn't match up with anything the church should have been handling. It wasn't charity or donations. The ledger's records seemed to suggest that these funds were being used for something else, something far darker. Carter could feel the weight of the mystery growing heavier with each page he turned. How could the nuns have possibly uncovered such a well-hidden operation? Had they truly seen something they weren't supposed to see? Or was there more to their disappearance than just bad luck? He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. It wasn't just about finding out who was responsible for taking the nuns. It was about exposing a network of corruption that had been woven into the very fabric of Willowbrook. Carter's thoughts kept circling back to the ledger, the only piece of evidence that might connect the dots. Jack was still poring over the documents, his brow furrowed as he read each line carefully. He was no longer just a retired deputy helping a former FBI agent. He was in this now, too. The conspiracy they were uncovering was too big for either of them to ignore. "Carter," Jack said, breaking the silence. "Look at this." He pointed to one of the entries in the ledger. It was a date, exactly 1 week before the nuns disappeared, and it was linked to a high-profile meeting at the town's most prestigious country club. The names listed were not just local business owners but also state politicians, the kind of people who had connections that stretched far beyond Willowbrook. Carter's eyes narrowed. So it wasn't just a random act. This was planned. The nuns must have been getting too close to something they shouldn't have. Jack nodded. "I think you're right, but this is bigger than I thought. We're talking about people with power, people who could make the nuns disappear without a second thought. They both knew this was a dangerous path to tread. The people involved had the means to silence anyone who posed a threat to their operations. But Carter wasn't going to back down. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let the truth stay buried for another 30 years. The next morning, Carter went back to the convent, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. The place was quiet as it had been for years. The once bustling building now sat empty, its halls echoing with memories of the nuns who had lived and worked there. As he walked through the convent, Carter felt a strange connection to the missing women. He could almost hear their laughter, their soft voices, and the warmth that had once filled the building. But that warmth was gone, replaced with the cold reality of the past. The place had been abandoned after the nuns disappeared, but there were still traces of their presence, old photographs on the walls, their personal belongings left behind. Carter stopped in front of the small chapel, where the nuns had once prayed together. The pews were empty now, but it still felt like the heart of the convent. He stepped inside and closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the women kneeling there offering their prayers. But even in this sacred space, Carter knew the answers he sought lay just beyond the walls. He had to keep going, to follow the trail, no matter where it led. He turned to Jack, who had followed him into the chapel. "We need to find more information. If the ledger is right, there has to be something hidden here, something that ties the nuns to all of this." Jack nodded, but his face was filled with doubt. "I don't know, Carter. This place hasn't been touched in years. What if there's nothing left to find?" Carter wasn't so sure. He had a feeling that the convent held the final piece of the puzzle. The ledger had mentioned a secret room, one that was supposedly hidden beneath the chapel. It wasn't much, just a brief note, but it was enough to make Carter wonder. "Let's search one more time," Carter said, determination in his voice. "I'm sure there's something here." The two men scoured the chapel, carefully looking for anything unusual. Jack checked behind the altar while Carter moved toward the back of the room, examining the walls. He ran his fingers along the stone, feeling for any signs of a hidden compartment. It wasn't long before he found something. A slight indentation in the wall, barely visible. It was small, but it was enough to spark his curiosity. Carter pressed his hand against the spot and pushed. To his surprise, the wall shifted slightly. A faint creak echoed through the room as the stone moved, revealing a narrow passage leading downward. It was dark, and the air smelled musty, but Carter didn't hesitate. He motioned for Jack to follow him, and together they descended into the darkness. The narrow passage led them to a small underground room. The walls were lined with shelves, some of them covered in dust, others filled with old books and papers. But what caught Carter's eye was a large wooden chest in the corner. It was old and weathered, its surface scratched and worn from years of neglect. With Jack's help, Carter opened the chest, and what they found inside took them both by surprise. The chest was filled with papers, but not just any papers. These were records, financial documents, notes, and photographs. As Carter sifted through the papers, he found something that sent a chill down his spine. A photograph of the 8 nuns, taken just days before their disappearance, sitting with several people Carter recognized from the ledger. These were the same men who had been involved in the secret meetings, the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. The discovery confirmed everything Carter had suspected. The nuns had known too much, and they had become a threat to the people who had been running things in Willowbrook for years. But now, with this evidence, Carter had the tools he needed to bring the truth to light. As they left the hidden room, Carter's thoughts raced. He now knew the full extent of the conspiracy. But the question remained. Would he be able to bring those responsible to justice before they could silence him too? The road ahead was dangerous, but Carter was ready. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop until the nun's story was finally told. Carter stood at the edge of the small underground room, his heart pounding in his chest. The chest they had opened was now empty, save for the papers and photographs they had uncovered. He looked over at Jack, who was still standing by the wall, staring at the shelves of old books and documents. There was no turning back now. The discovery in the chest had confirmed what Carter had suspected for months. The nuns had discovered something they shouldn't have, and they had paid the price for it. "Do you realize what this means, Jack?" Carter said, his voice low but steady. The nuns didn't just disappear by accident. They were part of something much bigger. They were trying to expose a secret, and whoever was behind this didn't want them to talk. Jack nodded slowly, still absorbing the weight of what they had found. The evidence in the chest was damning, and there was no question now that the nuns had been murdered to keep them quiet. "I can't believe it," Jack muttered. "All these years we thought they just ran off or something. But now, this changes everything." Carter felt the same way, but there was no time to waste. They had uncovered a piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough. The people behind the conspiracy, the ones who had orchestrated the nuns' disappearance, were still out there. They were still in control, and they would do anything to protect their secret. Carter knew that if he didn't act quickly, the evidence they had could disappear just as easily as the nuns had. They had to go public. But Carter knew that making the right move would be a dangerous game. If they revealed what they had found, the powerful people involved in the conspiracy would stop at nothing to silence them. The danger was real, but it didn't scare Carter. He had already lost so much, and now it wasn't just about solving a cold case. It was about bringing justice to the nuns, to their families, and to the people who had been living under the shadow of a lie for so many years. He turned to Jack. "We need to get this evidence to someone who can help us, someone who won't back down." Jack, who had been with him from the very beginning, didn't hesitate. You think the FBI will believe us now? I think they'll have no choice, Carter replied, his voice firm. But we can't go in empty-handed. We need more than just documents and photos. We need a clear connection, a way to prove that the people involved are still out there, and that they're still running the show. With that in mind, they left the convent and headed to the nearby town of Millfield, where Carter knew an old colleague from his time with the FBI still worked. Agent Sarah Williams had been a trusted ally back in the day, and Carter hoped that she would still be able to help them now. As they drove through the winding roads, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air felt heavier, and every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the web of mystery that had surrounded the nuns for so long. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but something about this case felt different. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. They arrived at Agent Williams's office, a small, nondescript building in the heart of Millfield. Carter knocked on the door, and after a moment, a voice from inside called out, "Come in." Sarah Williams was sitting behind a desk, flipping through some paperwork. When she saw Carter and Jack enter, her eyes widened in surprise. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, standing up to greet them. "Carter, it's been a long time. What's going on?" "We need your help," Carter said, not wasting any time. "We've uncovered something big, and we need to make sure it sees the light of day." Sarah raised an eyebrow but motioned for them to sit. "What's this about?" Carter placed the ledger on her desk, along with the photographs and documents they had found in the convent. "This is what we've uncovered," he said. 30 years ago, 8 nuns disappeared in Willowbrook. Everyone thought they just ran off, but we've discovered that they were murdered to silence them. They were about to expose a huge conspiracy, one that involves people in power in this town. Sarah looked at the papers for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She flipped through the documents and examined the photographs carefully. The more she saw, the more her expression changed. This is serious," she said quietly. "But it's also very dangerous. You understand that, right?" Carter nodded. "I do. But the truth needs to come out. These people, whoever they are, have been hiding behind their power for too long, and we need to stop them before they can hurt anyone else." Sarah sighed and leaned back in her chair. "You know as well as I do that exposing something like this could bring down the whole town. People will lose everything, their businesses, their livelihoods. But more than that, you'll be making enemies, powerful enemies. Are you ready for that?" "I've been ready for years," Carter replied, his voice unwavering. "I've lived with this case for far too long, Sarah. It's time to bring it to an end." Sarah paused, her gaze shifting between Carter and Jack. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll help, but we need to be careful. I'll start looking into this and make some calls. But you two are going to need to stay out of the spotlight for now. If anyone catches wind of what we're doing, we could end up right where the nuns did, gone without a trace." Carter understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about protecting themselves as well. As Sarah began to make her calls, Carter and Jack sat quietly, knowing that the next steps were critical. They spent the next few days gathering more evidence, speaking with people who might know something, and piecing together a timeline of events. Every lead they followed seemed to point toward the same people, the ones who had been at the center of the conspiracy all along. The connections were undeniable, but they still needed one last piece of the puzzle, and that's when Carter made a breakthrough. While going through the documents again, he found something that had been hidden in plain sight. A series of letters, buried deep within a pile of financial records, revealed a hidden connection between the powerful figures in Willowbrook and an international network of corruption. The letters were coded, but with Sarah's help they managed to decipher them. What they uncovered was more shocking than anything Carter had imagined. The conspiracy didn't just stop at the town. It stretched across the country and even reached overseas. Carter realized that they weren't just dealing with a small-town cover-up. They were up against a powerful criminal network that would stop at nothing to protect itself. But now that they had the evidence, there was no going back. They had Everything they needed to take down the people responsible for the nuns' deaths and the corruption that had plagued Willowbrook for so long. With the full extent of the conspiracy now exposed, Carter knew that the time had come. It was no longer just about solving a cold case. It was about bringing down an empire built on lies and bloodshed. Carter sat in the small office, staring at the evidence laid out in front of him. The pieces of the puzzle were all there: documents, photographs, letters, and financial records. They had everything they needed to expose the conspiracy that had been hiding in Willowbrook for decades. The truth about the nuns' disappearance and the people behind it was finally within their grasp. But the question that weighed heavily on Carter's mind was this: what would happen when they revealed everything? Would they be able to bring the culprits to justice, or would they become the next targets? The room felt heavy, the air thick with tension. He knew the risks. They were up against powerful people, politicians, business owners, and even law enforcement. These weren't just petty criminals. These were individuals who controlled the town and its secrets. But Carter wasn't backing down. He had been searching for answers for too long. The nuns deserved justice, and so did the families, who had lived in the shadow of the unanswered mystery. "Carter, we can't do this alone," Jack said, breaking the silence. He had been sitting quietly, flipping through the files, but now his eyes met Carter's with a sense of urgency. "We need to involve more people. If we go public with this, it's going to get ugly, and we need support. Real support." Carter nodded, but the doubt lingered. He had trusted the system before, and it had let him down. But now they had Agent Sarah Williams on their side. If anyone could make a difference, it was her. She was still working behind the scenes, following up on leads and making calls to higher-ups. But Carter knew they needed to act quickly before their enemies could catch wind of what was happening. "We can't wait too long," Carter replied, his voice firm. "The longer we hold on to this, the more time they have to bury it. We have the truth now. We just need to make sure it gets to the right people." Jack agreed, but the uncertainty was still in the air. The conspiracy they had uncovered wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was about a deep-rooted network that had infiltrated almost every level of society in Willowbrook. Exposing it meant putting everyone involved under the microscope. That could ruin lives. Lives of innocent people who had no idea what had been going on around them. But Carter knew it was the only way forward. The nuns had sacrificed everything for the truth, and now it was his turn to carry that burden. They decided to take the next step cautiously. Sarah had managed to make some important connections with law enforcement and legal teams that could help protect them as they made their move. She arranged for a meeting with a trusted contact within the FBI who could offer protection and ensure that the evidence was handled properly. They couldn't afford to mess this up. But as the meeting drew closer, Carter began to feel the weight of their actions. Each step forward felt like they were walking closer to a cliff's edge. The powerful people they were going up against weren't just going to let this go. They had to be prepared for the worst. The moment they exposed the truth, everything would change. No one's life in Willowbrook would be the same. The night before the meeting, Carter couldn't sleep. He walked through the small house where he was staying, trying to clear his mind. The shadows outside seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if the town itself was holding its breath. He couldn't help but wonder if he was doing the right thing. Was it worth it to bring the truth to light, if it meant turning the entire town upside down? Would the people of Willowbrook even believe it? Or would they turn on him just as they had turned away from the mystery all those years ago? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "We're ready. Tomorrow's the day. Don't hesitate." The words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. Carter knew what he had to do. He had to trust that the truth was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The next day, they met with Sarah's contact at the FBI. He was a no-nonsense agent, named Thomas Harris, someone who had spent years working on cases like this. He listened carefully as Carter and Jack laid out everything they had uncovered: the ledger, the photographs, the letters. Harris looked through the documents with a stern expression, his brow furrowed. "This is massive." Harris said, after a long pause. The connections here are far-reaching. You weren't wrong. These people have been operating under the radar for years. Carter's heart sank. It was one thing to suspect a conspiracy, but seeing it laid out in front of him made it all the more real. There was no turning back now. We're going to need to go public with this, Harris continued. The evidence is solid, but if we wait, they'll cover their tracks. We need to move fast. Carter agreed, but the weight of the decision felt heavy. Going public meant opening the floodgates. It meant that the truth would be out for everyone to see. The people of Willowbrook would finally know what had happened to the nuns and what their town had been hiding all these years. That afternoon, they arranged a press conference. It wasn't something Carter ever imagined himself doing, but the stakes were too high. As the time approached, he stood before the gathered reporters, the evidence in his hands. His heart raced, but his voice remained steady. 30 years ago, 8 nuns disappeared from Willowbrook, he began, his words clear and deliberate. What happened to them was not a random act. They were murdered because they discovered something. They were silenced to protect a conspiracy that has been operating right under our noses. The room was silent. The reporters scribbled furiously, but there was no immediate response. Carter continued, detailing the findings from the ledger and the evidence that had been uncovered. He explained how the conspiracy had spread through the town, reaching into every corner of life in Willowbrook. He named the people involved, the powerful figures who had manipulated the system for their own gain. As he spoke, Carter could feel the weight of his words pressing down on him. This was it. The truth was out there now. There would be no going back. When he finished, the room erupted into questions. Journalists fired off one after another, asking for more details, wanting to know everything. But Carter remained calm, answering as best as he could. It wasn't just about the nuns anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had poisoned Willowbrook. He couldn't let this chance slip away. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The FBI launched a full investigation into the conspiracy, and arrests were made. The town of Willowbrook was rocked to its core as more and more details came to light. People were shocked, horrified, and some were even in disbelief. Many refused to accept that the people they had trusted for so long could be responsible for such crimes. But the evidence was irrefutable. The nuns had been right, and they had given their lives to uncover the truth. As for Carter, he never thought about what would happen to him after the truth was revealed. He had spent so many years living in the shadow of the nuns' disappearance that it was only after their story was told that he realized the weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had given them justice, and in doing so, he had freed the town of Willowbrook from its darkest secret. Though it was painful to confront the past, Carter knew it was worth it. The nuns had given their lives for a cause they believed in, and now, their story would be remembered, not just as a tragic mystery but as a victory for the truth. In the end, that was all that mattered.